Hello and welcome to this video, which is going to be helping you with your Germany end of unit assessment. All classes will be completing a 1-hour exam where you'll be asked 6 different questions, and those questions are exactly what's on your cheat sheet that you'll be preparing for in lessons. It will involve 3 times interpretation questions on attitudes towards the Jews. So there'll be a 4-mark question where you'll talk about content, a 4-mark question where you'll talk about provenance, and an 8-mark question where you'll use some own knowledge. There'll also then be a describe question that asks you to describe 2 negative impacts of World War II on German civilians, an 8-mark knowledge question where you have to explain in what ways Nazi Germany was a terror state, and then a 12-mark question where you'll be thinking about who was more affected by Nazi policies, was it women or youth, and you'll have to talk about both before concluding. In this PowerPoint, I have copied and pasted some slides from previous revision PowerPoints that I've done on part 1, 2 and 3. This video is all you need because this has everything on it that is going to come up into the exam, and there's nothing on here that's irrelevant. Everything on this PowerPoint is stuff that you're going to have to write about in one of those 6 questions. One of the questions you're going to do is a 4-mark question saying describe 2 negative impacts of World War II on German civilians. You can pick from any of the following that I've got on the next slide. You could pick rationing and area bombing, or you could pick something like refugees and employment. Any of the 4 areas on the next slide would be fine. For this 4-mark question, you can pick any 2 of the areas that have been listed here. First of all, let's talk about rationing and some key points you could use if you're going to use this as one of your 2 impacts for this question. Now, in terms of rationing, there were few shortages at first. Nazis were doing really well at the beginning of World War II. Between 1939 and 1941, they successfully defeated lots of nations, and that meant that they could actually take the food and other goods from these nations that they defeated, places like Belgium, Holland, and France. However, over time, there started to be more shortages, especially of things like soap and also clothes as well. So they ended up introducing a more strict system of rationing, and how many rations you got depended on your age, your occupation and your race. So for instance, if you worked in a weapons factory in World War II, you would have got more rations than other groups of people because it was seen as more essential for the war effort that you were well fed. Just like if you were pregnant, you would have got more rations to try and make sure that you had a healthy child. It also depended on race, so if you were Jewish, you received less rations than other people. Now, over time, rationing was more and more necessary and the food shortages got worse and worse. And by 1944, when the German army was in retreat, there were lots of terrible shortages. As a result of the bombings that were going on as well, there was lots of issues with distributing food, and there were lots of people that were homeless that also couldn't get access to the resources that they needed. Another area that you could talk about is the area bombing. So this was particularly happening from 1942 onwards. Now, the British and the Americans had a system where one bombed during the day and one bombed during the night. And at first they wanted to try and target industrial and military sites. However, they realised that their bombs weren't particularly accurate, and therefore they decided to switch to a policy of area bombing or blanket bombing, where they just dropped loads of bombs on different cities, hoping it would hit those desired targets. You can see here that 61 cities were attacked. Actually, in thinking about areas like Dresden, where there was a particularly bad attack in early 1945, 70% of it was completely destroyed. As a result of these bombings, 3.6 million homes were destroyed, and 400,000 Germans were killed in these raids. And they had a real big impact on them, and they also weakened morale. Now, kind of linked to area bombing is the refugee crisis. This refugee crisis was a really big problem towards the end of the war. You know, we've already seen that 1944 to 1945 was this kind of key time that was really bad for the Germans. And it was really bad in terms of bombings, but it was also really bad for the refugee crisis. Now, by January 1945, the Soviet army, the army of the USSR, had basically advanced into German territory, and that meant millions of German people had to try and flee from where they lived to try and escape this army that was carrying out lots of atrocities like the murder of innocent civilians and the rape of lots of German women. So there was a real problem. And when these people are leaving these areas and they're fleeing westwards away from the advancing Soviet army, they're entering cities like Dresden that have been destroyed. And they're finding when they get there, there's not even homes to stay in. There's a lack of water, there's a lack of sanitation, and things like diseases are spreading at this point too. So we've obviously talked about 3 areas. I'm just going to talk about one last one, and then you need to pick the 2 that you're most comfortable with, the ones that you think you're going to remember. So lastly, we've got about employment. Now, generally, there was a labour shortage on the German home front. They employed a man called Albert Speer in 1942 to become the Minister for Munitions, and he was hired to try and solve these shortages. He did lots of things to try and help the German economy do better in war. For instance, he did things like having factory workers on shift work, where the factories were open for 24 hours a day to make sure that Germany could produce more goods. And actually, their industrial production peaked in August 1944, despite the massive bombings that were going on. He also convinced Hitler he actually needed to use women in these factories. Obviously, Hitler had been very much against this because he wanted women to focus on having children and to focus on the 3 Ks. But in 1943, he had to kind of concede this and allow women between the ages of 17 and 45 to register for war work. Not every woman worked, but the idea is they were going to get more women into these factories to replace the men that needed to go and fight on the home front. But they didn't just use women, they also used 7 million foreign labourers. But it's probably not worth writing about that when you're doing your notes, because obviously we're focusing particularly on the impact on German civilians. So pick any 2, and you might want to pause the video here to make some notes on the 2 areas that you're going to be discussing. Next question on your assessment would be this 8-mark question, where it will say, in what ways did the Nazis create a terror state? Now, in this question, you're going to spend about 10 minutes writing an answer, and you're going to want to have 2 paragraphs that are filled with knowledge and also some explanations of why this created a terror state. Now, you've got some options about what you could write about. And remember, if you want to know more details on this, you could even go back to YouTube and watch some of the lessons we did on terror during online learning. Essentially, you need to pick 2 areas out of the following 4. You could talk about the SS, you could talk about the Gestapo, you could talk about concentration camps, or you could talk about the way they controlled the police and the courts. So you can pick any 2 of those areas, but you've got to know them in detail. On the next slide, I've just copied and pasted my explanations about terror from a previous Part 1 Nazi Germany revision video. This has all the key information that you need to know, and obviously remember you're just going to pick out 2 areas that you're going to know in great depth. You might even want to combine a paragraph on the SS and the concentration camps together, and then you might even decide to do a separate one on the Gestapo. It's up to you, but you need to know 2 areas in depth. We've seen that the majority of the German people liked the Nazis. They liked their policies and they were convinced by propaganda that the Nazis were benefiting Germany. But for the small minority that decided that they wanted to oppose the Nazis tried to crush that opposition using terror. So we're going to talk through the 4 main forms of terror that you need to know about. First of all, we have the SS. And you might remember the SS from them being the people murdered the SA during the Night of Long Knives. It started off being very small in 1925, being Hitler's personal bodyguards, but they expanded, and by 1935 there were 200,000 of them. By 1939 there were 250,000 of them. And there were lots of different branches with them. Some people have talked about the SS being a state within a state. Basically, they were almost like a whole government within, because there were so many different branches of them. Some members of the SS had jobs to hunt down opponents. Others of them, called the Death's Head Unit, ran things like concentration camps. Some of them were the Waffen-SS, which was basically some of the elite armed forces. There were lots of different elements of the SS. We've just mentioned that they ran concentration camps, and remember that they had the first concentration camp from March 1933 at Dachau, just outside of Munich. These concentration camps at first were for opponents, people like the communists, and from 1936 the Nazis started arresting people for being homosexual, for being alcoholics, for being prostitutes. You could be sent there for doing things like writing some kind of anti-Nazi slogan, or owning a banned book, for instance one by a Jewish author, or even suggesting that the Nazis were bad for business. So concentration camps were really effective for encouraging people to toe the line. The majority of people saw them as necessary for people that had gone against the Nazis. And remember, these are very different from the extermination camps that exist from 1942, where they put people that were Jewish and Roma and Sinti. So concentration camps were incredibly effective at stopping opposition. But the Nazis had something even more effective, and that was the Gestapo, the secret state police, which remember they had in Prussia from April 1933. Now the Gestapo terrified many people because you didn't know who the members of the Gestapo were. You didn't know where they were they listening to your conversation? And they had this reputation of being all-knowing. There was a common phrase that people used to say in Nazi Germany was that you had to speak through a flower, only saying good things. You had to really trust a person to criticize the Nazis in front of them, because they could easily have been a member of the Gestapo or an informant, and for even just saying one joke or comment, you could be arrested and put in a concentration camp. Some parents even genuinely feared their own children would report them to the Gestapo. And the Gestapo deliberately arrest people in the middle of the night in order to kind of create that fear and make people very aware of their presence, and that doing something wrong could lead to you suffering those same consequences. Now, the Gestapo is really important for helping the Nazis stay in power because it means it's really difficult to organise effective widespread opposition. Let's say I wanted to start an attempted revolution. Well, I'd need thousands upon thousands of people to join me. But every single time I tell somebody about that plan, I'm risking all of us being exposed and going to a concentration camp. So the Gestapo are incredibly important in helping the Nazis stop opposition. But in actual reality, there were only 20,000 members of the Gestapo, and at its height, it only had 30,000. So it's actually a relatively small organisation. For instance, in some cities, they had less than 10 agents. So actually, what made them so powerful was the informers, the fact that lots of German citizens used to tell on their friends and neighbours, and that's been found out after the Second World War. The final area for terror to know about is that the Nazis also controlled the courts. Even if you hadn't committed a crime, there was basically no way of getting out of it. Remember, since February 1933, when the Nazis passed the emergency decree after the Reichstag fire, people didn't have the same civil rights anymore. They didn't have freedom of speech, and the Nazis could arrest you without any evidence. There also wasn't a fair trial anymore, because the Nazis created something called the People's Courts, where you would have some normal judges, but you would also have Nazi judges that outnumbered them who would be able to sentence you. They even increased the amount of crimes that had the death penalty attached to them from 3 to 46. By the Second World War, you could be executed just for listening to the BBC. So terror was incredibly effective at silencing the few people that decided that they wanted to oppose the Nazis. So you need to make sure that you know about terror, but also make sure that you balance it with propaganda and popularity, because terror wasn't needed for the majority of German people. Most people did conform. If you do get asked about how the Nazis controlled Germany, you can also mention, if you want, how they controlled the youth and how they controlled the churches. But we'll talk about those details later on. You've already heard me talk through a summary all about terror. Now, all I've done over this next couple of slides is copy and pasted information from the terror video that was done in online learning. You might just want to pause it and add any extra details that you haven't already got down, just to strengthen your 8-mark answer and your plan. It's up to you though. So pause the video here if you'd like to add any extra notes about the SS and the Gestapo. Same as before, pause the video here if you'd like to add any extra notes about concentration camps or the way that they controlled the police and courts. Next question you have to answer is this 12-mark question that says which of the following groups was more affected by Nazi policies? Was it women or the youth? So you're going to have to write a paragraph on women where you think about what were their policies like towards them between 1933 and 1945, and you want to think about how much did it affect them, how did it change over time. Then you do another paragraph on the youth where you do something similar. Think about what were the policies like towards them inside and outside education. How did things change over time? How did these policies affect them? And then you then come to a conclusion where you'd say which one you thought was more affected and why, and you'd explain that in as much detail as you could in that conclusion. So in this 12-mark answer, you'd spend about 15 minutes writing what you could about those two groups and then coming to a conclusion. On the next few slides, you'll see some extracts from the Part 2 Nazi Germany Social Policies video I put on during online learning. It's that same information, but listen carefully and think about how you're going to apply that information to this exam question that you'll be doing as part of your end of unit assessment. The next area that you need to know about is women and how Nazi policies affected them. Now, there have been some major changes for women in the 1920s in the period of Weimar. Women had had a lot more freedom than ever before. Many more of them had got jobs and were much more career-driven than in the past. Nazis hated these changes though, and they wanted to reverse them straight away. They'd been really worried about the declining birth rate, and so they wanted women to start focusing again on being traditional in their role, being wives and mothers. So they asked them to focus on the 3 Ks, and that was about children, church and cooking. So they tried to encourage them to focus on having lots of children in a few different ways. First of all, they gave out loans of 1,000 marks if you had 4 children. This was because one of the reasons that many women hesitated is because children tend to be quite expensive. So the Nazis passed this law for the encouragement of marriage. It would give you 250 marks that you were allowed to keep for each child that you had. 1,000 marks might not sound very much, but it's the equivalent of 9 months' wages, about £18,000 in today's money. So it was a lot of money. They also tried to celebrate motherhood, and every year on Hitler's mother's birthday, they held an award ceremony, the Motherhood Cross. And this is where they would give you a medal depending on how many children you had. If you had 8 children, you get a gold medal. If you had 6 children, you get silver. And if you had 4, you would get a bronze medal. So they encouraged women to have lots of kids through this celebration of motherhood. They also even introduced something quite extreme called the Lebensborn program. Now, at this point in the 1930s, if you were pregnant outside of marriage, there would have been a real kind of sense of shame in the community at that point. So Nazis introduced homes for unmarried mothers in the hope that they wouldn't then try and abort their children. Because remember, the pressures were very different for women at that point, and it was seen as a real shame on your family to have a child out of wedlock. So the Nazis opened these homes for unmarried mothers, Spring of Life or Lebensborn programs. But later on, during the Second World War, these places actually became brothels where women would go deliberately to get pregnant by a racially pure SS officer. Nazis didn't just try and encourage some women to have children, they actively tried to stop other women from having children. And women that didn't fit into their racial ideal, women that weren't part of the Aryan race, or women that had some kind of hereditary illness, for instance, if they were hereditary deaf, the Nazis then sterilised these people from the age of 10 to try and stop them having children that wouldn't be, as the Nazis saw, healthy enough for society. So there were some positive things for women to encourage them to have children, but there was also a really negative impact on lots of women who were sterilised, or some women who couldn't have children were then shamed as if they weren't fulfilling their role. Now, Nazis didn't just want women to be wives and mothers. That also then means that they don't want them to have jobs. So they essentially forced people to leave their jobs from 1933. Female doctors, lawyers, all these kind of career-minded women were forced out of these jobs that they'd worked really hard for. Women were allowed to continue with certain jobs that were seen as female specific, for instance, being a midwife, but most jobs they weren't allowed to be part of. They weren't even allowed to do things anymore like jury service, as women were seen as too emotional for this. Essentially, all that progress with equality that was made in the 1920s was reversed by the Nazis. Women couldn't even decide exactly how they wanted to look. They weren't allowed to do things like smoking. They weren't allowed to wear things like trousers. They were expected to have plaited hair, no makeup, and they were even supposed to be a certain weight so that it could be healthy for childbearing. Now, even though from a modern point of view, a lot of us would look at these policies with horror, actually at the time, most women welcomed these changes and liked the fact they were going back to a more traditional role. Another key group for the Nazis to control was young people. Now, the Nazis had wanted to create a 1,000-year Reich, and so indoctrinating the youth was absolutely essential. They believed it was much easier to brainwash a child and make them politically loyal than it was an adult. And so in order to secure the future of Nazi Germany, they needed to make sure that young people grew up really supportive of Nazi ideology. And they try and push this through in two different areas. First of all, they make sure that schools and the education system is teaching Nazi ideals. And second of all, they controlled young people in their time outside of school through the Hitler Youth and the League of German Maidens. So let's think first of all about education and how they controlled what was going on there. Well, they wanted to drastically change the curriculum, and they rewrote textbooks as well to make sure that they only taught Nazi ideals. Teachers were also controlled because they were expected to be part of the National Socialist Teachers League. If they refused to join, or if they were somebody that wasn't politically reliable, they would be fired. They also completely changed the curriculum, and they made sure that each subject reflected their ideology. For instance, in a geography lesson, students would be taught about Lebensraum, this idea of having living space in the East, and that it was right for Germany to be able to conquer other lands to give more space for German people. Even in maths, it was very much about pushing forward their political views. For instance, they used to have a lot of questions that were based on costing how much mentally and physically disabled people cost Germany. They also had things like questions where they would ask them to calculate angles. They were talking about dropping bombs on places like Poland. So every subject had a real emphasis on Nazi ideals. History, they would talk about things like the stab in the back myth and the fact that the Weimar politicians were the November criminals. In science lessons, they would teach about the fake science of eugenics, definitely not real science, where they would teach about there being different ideas and different races having different strengths, and they would talk about why the Aryan race was superior in their mind as well. So all of their lessons very much reflected Nazi ideology. But they also wanted to control their free time, and they did this through the Hitler Youth. Now, the Hitler Youth had actually been around since 1925, but as the Nazis came to power, this group got more and more popular. The Nazis wanted all of the young people to be in it, because then it would train them for their future roles in society. Boys in the Hitler Youth would train for the army, and they would do lots of military drills. And girls would be part of the sister organisation of the League of German Maidens. There they would be taught to be good wives and mothers. They would be doing lots of things like gymnastics to keep them fit for childbirth. So the idea is that they're reinforcing those gender roles through the Hitler Youth organisations. Now in 1936, they then closed down all the other youth organisations. So people only have one choice. If you want to do something outside of school and you want to join a club, there is now only the Hitler Youth. Most young people didn't mind that at that point though, and it's estimated that 95% of the youth supported the Nazis, at least at first. There was loads of positives for young people at this point. They liked the free camping trips, they liked the fact that they felt valued, and they felt powerful as well, because they knew that they could tell on their teachers or their parents and get them arrested. So there was this real sense of lots of young people enjoying the power and enjoying the activities that they got to do for free. However, in 1939, 6 years after the Nazis have come to power, they are less popular with young people because they make membership to the Hitler Youth compulsory. They say everyone has to join. Now, a lot of young people didn't like the fact they now had to give up their weekends to go on the Hitler Youth camping trips, and they had to give up some of their weeknights as well. So there starts to be some more youth opposition from 1939, even though for the most part, people generally still supported the Nazis. You do need to be aware of some of the youth opposition groups that I'll talk more about in the part 3 video. There were some groups, for instance, the Swing Youth, who just wanted to listen to things like jazz music that had been banned by the Nazis. There were also some other groups, like the White Rose, that was created in World War II, that was about wider opposition to the Nazis and not just about a small amount of their policies. So overall, young people broadly supported the Nazis and liked these changes, but they definitely were indoctrinated through the Hitler Youth and the education programs. Pause the video here if you want to make any notes about them. You're also going to have 3 interpretation questions that are all about German attitudes towards Jewish people. Now, for 2 of them, you don't really need any own knowledge because the own knowledge is going to come into question 3. Remember that cats produce kittens. So in question 1, the cats question, we need to think about content, and we'd have to think about what are both of them saying about German attitudes towards Jews. We'd pick out 2 quotes from interpretation A, we'd pick out 2 quotes from interpretation B, and then we'd do a 1-sentence summary of how they differ. Question 2, which in our cats produce kittens, is the produce, which is about provenance. We'd have to think about why are they different? Why are they saying different things about German attitudes towards Jewish people? The first thing I'd do is I'd talk about the author, and I'd talk about how the authors of interpretation A and B differ and why that means they are saying different things. I would then do a second point where I'd think about the when and the why. Why have they both been produced? What's the purpose of each of those sources? When have they been produced? How does that affect what they say about German attitudes towards Jewish people? And that second question that again you'd spend 5 minutes on, you want to think about who, and you want to then think about when and why, and how that affects what's being said. The final question, which is worth 8 marks, so you'll spend twice as long on it, you'll spend about 10 minutes on it, you're going to have to answer which interpretation gives the more convincing opinion about German attitudes towards Jewish people. So you'd start off with explaining 2 things that are convincing about interpretation A. You say interpretation A is convincing because it says that, and you'd pick out a quote. You then say something about, from my own knowledge, I know that, and you do that same thing again for interpretation A. Then you do exactly the same for interpretation B, picking out 2 quotes and supporting both of them with detailed own knowledge. And then you'd come to a conclusion about which one was more convincing and why. In that conclusion, you can't be wrong, but you've got to explain which one gave the more convincing content, which one said the best things. So that's the technique that you're going to have to do. Now, you're going to want to make sure that you're reading that source or those sources and make sure you're thinking about them at the heart of your answer. But on the next few slides, it does go over the policies towards the Jews, which you could listen to if you need a reminder. Remember, this won't really help with question 1 and 2, but it's essential that question 3 involves lots of own knowledge. So you might decide that you're going to pick out some own knowledge from this information on the next few slides. The next area that you need to know about is the policies towards Jewish people in Germany. Now, as we already know, the Nazis were incredibly anti-Semitic, and they believed in this idea of an Aryan master German race, and they believed that Jewish people didn't fit into this. They saw them as part of a group of people called the Untermenschen, which means the subhumans, and they saw Jewish people as a racial and biological threat to Germany. Now, there was actually relatively few Jewish people in Germany, only about 500,000 and less than 1% of the population. But these people were blamed for all of Germany's problems. The Nazis blamed them for the loss of the First World War, the signing of the armistice, the Treaty of Versailles, and all the economic problems that came after, for instance, hyperinflation. So they started persecuting Jewish people right from the beginning of when they came to power. And you can see there are three different phases of their policies towards Jewish people. It started with this phase of discrimination between 1933 to 1937. It then turned violent with the outbreak of the Night of Broken Glass in 1938, and by 1942 it had become a phase called the Final Solution. We'll talk about what they did to Jewish people through these three different phases. Nazis came to power in January 1933, and they immediately began discriminating against the Jewish people. They started acting at first quite cautiously, as they didn't know how the German public would react, and so they began by boycotting Jewish businesses from the 1st of April. This is where the brown shirts, the SA, stood outside and intimidated shoppers, so this was a measure that was supposed to harm Jewish people financially. They also then pushed them out of lots of different jobs, including pushing Jews out of the civil servants, being lawyers, and they could no longer be doctors that treated Aryan German patients. They could now only treat other Jewish people. As a result of this level of discrimination, 37,000 Jewish people left Germany, often not being able to leave with more than about 1,000 marks and only with what they could carry. Some people made the very difficult decision to leave at that point. Other people stayed, hoping that things wouldn't get any worse, but they did in September 1935 when the Nazis passed the Nuremberg Laws. These said you could only be counted as a German citizen if you had what they deemed as purely German blood. As Jewish people were defined as un-German, therefore lost their civil rights and became second-class citizens. Laws were passed, for instance, that said Jewish people couldn't marry Aryans, and if you were already together, you would be separated. If you refused to separate, you could end up in a concentration camp. Now, there were those two official Nuremberg laws saying that you could only be a German citizen if you had German blood, and saying that you couldn't marry an Aryan citizen if you didn't have the German blood. But they also introduced loads of unofficial Nuremberg-style laws all over Germany that banned Jewish people from restaurants, parks, walking on the pavement, swimming pools. Lots of different places that Jewish people could no longer go. And the point was that the Nazis wanted to socially isolate them. They wanted people to see Jewish people as somehow different and separate, and they didn't want Jewish and non-Jewish people being together anymore. So by 1935, Jewish people had already had to put up with horrific levels of discrimination. But things get even worse over time as the German population didn't react badly to the boycotts or the Nuremberg laws. There was no opposition from them, and therefore the Nazis became more extreme over time. Nazi policies towards the Jews turned violent in November 1938 with an event called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. During this night, Jewish businesses, homes and synagogues were destroyed in an act of coordinated violence and outpouring of hatred against the innocent Jewish community. 91 Jewish people were killed in this night. 30,000 more were arrested and sent to concentration camps for the apparent crime of being Jewish. Concentration camps had existed before this, but they had been used to house political prisoners, people that opposed the Nazis, and now Jewish people are being put in them just for being Jewish. This is a terrible event and one that horrified the Jewish community. The fact that their businesses had been burnt down, their homes had been destroyed, and over 250 synagogues had been destroyed as well. The whole point of this was to terrorise the Jewish community and make them try and leave Germany, and many of them really did try, but the problem was that other countries wouldn't accept them. So they really struggled to be able to leave. Things get even worse in 1939 after World War II breaks out. Now, the Nazis already believed that they had a Jewish problem when they had 500,000 Jews. As they start to invade other nations, the Jewish population grows. For instance, in Poland and the Soviet Union, there were over 3 million Jewish people that lived there. The Nazis' new solution to trying to deal with what they called their Jewish problem was to put them into ghettos. These were areas of the city that they cornered off, they put Jews in, and then they walled them up in there. They were crowded, there wasn't enough food, and over 500,000 people died due to starvation and disease in these ghettos. Conditions were horrendous, and deliberately so, to try and make sure that as many Jewish people died as possible. In 1941, as well as having this policy of ghettos, they also started the mass shooting squads called the Eisengruppen. These were groups of people that went into the Eastern Territories, places like Lithuania and Poland, rounded up Jewish people and executed them there and then. 1 million innocent Jewish men, women and children were murdered in this way. So you can see this period of 1938 to 1941 is a horrendous one of violence and the murder, either directly or indirectly, of so many innocent people. Nazis had already murdered so many Jewish people before 1942, but things get even worse then when they make what they call their final solution to the Jewish problem, a decision in which they plan to kill all of Europe's Jews, all 11 million of them. And at this meeting that's held in somewhere called Wannsee, just outside of Berlin, they coordinate the logistics of murdering all these people. And they decide that they're going to try and murder up to 60,000 innocent people a day. They're going to do this through purpose-built extermination camps, places that you might have heard of before like Auschwitz, and over 1 million people are killed on that site alone. As a result of this terrible policy of the final solution, 6 million Jewish people have been killed by the Nazis by 1945. That's what you need to know about the policies towards the Jews. Pause here if you need to make any notes. Well done for getting to the end of this video. You've now heard us talk about all of the key areas that you need to know for this exam. What you need to do now is make sure that your cheat sheets are really well planned, but also you need to make sure you're then spending some time learning that information. For instance, you might read over your notes on the youth, try turning over that page, and then try a red pen, black pen activity where you write down everything you can remember, turn the sheet over, and then add everything you forgot in a second colour. So don't just work on filling out those cheat sheets, but try and do some activities that are going to help actually embed that knowledge and help you consolidate that knowledge. Remember, if you're really stuck, please go and see your history teacher and we'll try and help you as much as we can.